I'm going to do some introductions. So welcome everybody to this, our second webinar with Professor Mary Uhl-Bien. Before we start, can I ask that everyone ensure their microphones are muted during the webinar? Can I also ask you to just take a moment to introduce yourselves in the chat space, who you are and where you're from. Thank you to those of you who've been doing that already. And as we go along, if you've got questions that you'd like Mary to answer at the end of the webinar, please put those in the chat space, because Matthew and I will keep an eye on those as Mary's talking. So we plan to have that Q&A time, and also just to let you know that this webinar will be made available on YouTube in the next couple of weeks. So with all that in mind, we're delighted to welcome back Professor Mary Uhl-Bien, one of the world's leading pioneers in the application of complexity thinking to leadership and organisational agility. Mary is the BNSF Railway Endowed Professor of Leadership at the Neely School of Business at Texas Christian University. In addition to her work on complexity leadership theory and adaptive space, she's also researched and written extensively on relational leadership and fellowship. Active in executive education nationally and internationally, and has taught for the Brookings Institute and the Gallup Organization. So Mary's been conducting research into complexity leadership theory for over a decade, focusing on uncovering the key sources and mechanisms that enable innovation, transformation and change, including in hospitals and across health systems. And this research has found that successful innovations emerge from what we could call entrepreneurial or informal networks, but that must be supported and developed in adaptive spaces if they are to fulfill their potential for transforming what are often quite formal and bureaucratic organisations. So in this follow-up session, Mary will focus on the practical steps we need to take to effectively initiate and support these adaptive spaces, as well as outlining the principles crucial to helping them function effectively, complementing the current leadership approaches. So now that I've set the scene for you, let me hand over to Mary. Thank you.
Thank you, Gareth. Good morning, everyone. Well, morning here. Good afternoon to you all. It's very nice to be back. I do want to start by saying this is, I would say, an advanced version of complexity leadership, because we've already done the intro version. So this is now exciting for me because I get an opportunity to talk more about how this works. Quite often what I do is I give an overview and an introduction and describe what complexity is, why it's affecting the world, how it's affecting the world, and what it means for leadership. But I don't often get to talk about how we actually do this kind of leadership. So I'm really excited to be able to do that. I did receive a set of questions from Matthew and Gareth, which were really helpful. Many of you sent those questions in. I took them and organized them into some themes. So what I'm going to do is just see if I can share my slide deck. Share screen. Hold on one second. And see if I can get over to PowerPoint. Oh, there we go. Okay, can you all see that? Matthew, can you see that? Okay. I'm going to put it in presentation mode. If anybody can't see it, unmute and tell me. So that we should be up on screen now. Matthew, I see you talking. Can you see this? Oh, he's talking to someone else.
Yes, Mary, we can see it. Good.
Oh, thank you. All right. Okay, so what I'm going to do is talk about the art of creating adaptive spaces. This was a title that Matthew came up with, and I thought it was great. Now, he also had to spread innovation in the organization, and I thought, I kind of have some thoughts on that. So I stuck it in the conclusion because there are some issues around spreading innovation using adaptive space. So what we're going to do instead is focus primarily on what the model is, what adaptive space is, and how we create it. And there were some key questions that were asked. So the first question was, what is adaptive space? I want to make sure that we really have a clear sense of what that is. And then how do we enable it, particularly in unfavorable environments? And I've had other people ask me. I will dive into that one. And then how do we measure and demonstrate outcomes? I'll give some pointers on that. That's been an important thing that has come up in the recent work that we've been doing. And then skills and roles that are required to create and sustain adaptive space. This isn't a particular slide itself. This is a theme throughout the slide deck. So what I want to do first is start with what is adaptive space. And I have about 20 or 25 minutes. So I'm just going to run through slides, I'm viewing this as a primer, basically, to get us going. It's not going to answer all of your questions, but hopefully it gives us the context to then have a good discussion afterwards where we can dig into more particulars around how we actually do this. So and I'm trying to keep this as simple as I can. So what I'm going to do is take complexity and make it as simple as possible. And in that simplicity, just give you real basics. So the first one is this. Adaptive space is a pretty simple concept. It's conditions that enable the adaptive process to occur. So if we know and understand complexity, what we know is that complexity is happening in the world. When there's complexity in the environment, organizations need to respond to complexity with complexity. And what that means is that they need to enable adaptive responses in the organization. So they have to be adaptive to the changes that are happening around them. And that adaptability occurs through what we have discovered very recently as what I'm calling the adaptive process. So I'm going to run through what the adaptive process is. And then once we understand that process, what we know is that adaptive space is the conditions that allow this process to occur. So the very simple view of it is this, and now what I'm going to do is run through the model. So let's start with the adaptive process. Okay, now to do this, I want you all to think about yourselves. We have however many people who signed up for this webinar and people who've watched the previous one. My guess is that people who are doing that because they're somewhere in the adaptive process. The fact that you're interested in complexity, trying to understand and learn it so you can learn new ways of doing leadership means that you're feeling some kind of pressure to understand the world in a different way. Would you all agree with that? Matthew and Gareth, I can see you. Would you agree with that? That's why most people are motivated to do this. So that's the need to innovate, and that is coming from pressures in the environment. So the world is changing around us. Those pressures come in, and what they do is they cause us then to have to think about how to innovate. The challenge with that need to innovate is that we aren't in worlds that are unconstrained. It's not like we can come up with an idea and say, wow, I'm going to go do this, and then go do it. Instead, we're operating in current existing worlds and in infrastructures that are quite often not responsive to that change necessarily. And the shorthand for this is the need to produce. So there's an existing world. It pushes for status quo. It pushes for results and for efficiency and for control and all of those kinds of things. So as we experience this pressure that motivates for us and need to innovate, it goes into tension with the need to produce. So these two things then operate in tension. And the basic premise of the complexity model is that the core dynamic of complexity is tension. It's the adaptive process is all about engaging tension. In previous webinars, what I've talked about is what organizations do in response to that. They wipe that tension out. But what we need to do is engage the tension. So again, the fact that you are sitting here listening to this means that you're willing to engage the tension. You're willing to listen to something push up against your way of thinking and get you to think a little bit differently. Now that process, because a lot of people don't understand tension, what we've done is we've put the word conflicting on it. And what it means is that there are things that are conflicting worldviews, conflicting preferences or needs, and complexity. This is often referred to as heterogeneity. And what we need to do is understand that the tension dynamic is basically a conflicting process. So things are conflicting. Instead of trying to get rid of the conflict or manage the conflict away, which is what many managers do, we need to engage that. So we need to allow the tension to occur. We need to engage the conflicting process so that different ideas, different forces come together, and not just the ones about the new ideas for how to do things, but also that the key thing is the pressure against that existing dynamic of the need to produce. It's the engagement of the innovation with the production that generates the right kind of adaptive process. But that conflicting only occurs if we can have adaptive space for it to take place. So what we need in organizations or in our heads is a space for the conflicting. And that means opening it up. So this is a fractal process. Adaptability occurs on the individual level. It scales up. So individual, between people, in small groups, between groups, in organizations, between organizations. It's the same dynamic and the same process no matter what level you're looking at. And in each of those places, what you need is space for the conflicting to occur. But conflicting only generates adaptability if it's combined with connecting. So what you need to have is conflicting and connecting together. And I would say this is a lot of the problem we have in the world right now. In the past, I always hoped for more voice and more. I remember a time when I was pining for it to be like the 60s when we had protest movements again. Now, in the early work, I was like, we need more of that. Now I'm looking at it going, oh my gosh, we probably don't need more of that. We have so much of it now. And the challenge we have currently in the world is we have a lot of conflicting, but not necessarily much connecting. So to get to adaptability, you need to have both of those together, conflicting and connecting. All right, now, the nice thing about this adaptive process model is that it does include innovation, but it doesn't make the whole story about innovation. So we do need to innovate, but innovation is important in this model to the extent that it leads to adaptability. And innovation isn't everything. So the answer isn't just innovation, it's innovation engaging in the right way in adaptive space with the need to produce to generate adaptability. So the need to produce gives you the current results. What adaptability does is it gives you sustainability. It helps to ensure the system will be healthy in the future, so it's about future viability. Okay, this adaptive process occurs for everyone. We're all in the process of adapting all the time. Some of us adapt more than others. Some of us tend not to like to adapt. We want to stay the same, so we don't engage the process. But what I want you to understand really is these two concepts, that if you're going to understand complexity, you need to understand the tension dynamic. In the tension dynamic, you need to understand that it's comprised of conflicting and connecting, and that essentially the core thing we're looking for is for these ideas to come together and engage, and Russ Marion and I always call this to interact. And in that interaction is where you can generate something new, something novel, the best idea. So this comes from the idea of creativity. It's the creativity research has shown this for a long time, but it's really at the core of complexity, right? So you need to have conflicting combined with connecting. When you have that process occur, no one individual or one agent owns the idea. As you see, it's shared, it's in the shared space. That's where it's generated. So when I do conflicting and connecting or ideating or interacting with colleagues to generate this work, which is how this work came about, I can't say that any one of us owns it. It was in the combination of us pushing against each other that the ideas were generated. We couldn't have done it individually. Now, conflicting and connecting has this piece back here, which I just showed you, which is about trying to understand what surfaces or what sparks from the collision of good ideas. That's one version of connecting. But there's another version of connecting as well. And that version is the idea that's called linking up. So linking up occurs when the idea is sparked, but this is different. This is about linking up people or linking up agents, poised agents, in ways that you can spark novelty or that you can enhance information flows that are essential for things to get done in organizations. So this connecting, this linking up version really is more the network dynamic that's at the core of complexity. An emergence process occurs through linking up. It's when agents come together, they link up, they share a bit of their resonance, meaning they've bonded, they've connected, and then that gives you a bigger aggregate, and then you get more meta aggregates, and those scale up into emergence. So this linking up process is also core to the dynamic of complexity. All right, so in your minds, keep in your heads the idea of conflicting and connecting. Keep in your head the idea of the adaptive process. Essentially, what we're trying to do is enable the adaptive process. In conflicting, to do that, the first thing we need to do is recognize and engage adaptive tension. So the conflict literature talks about this. I kind of view complexity as a meta framework for a lot of things we know from other areas in the field or in the literature. And adaptive tension is something that we need to recognize. So conflict will say there's good conflict and there's bad conflict. The good conflict is the conflict they usually refer to as productive or ideological conflict. Bad conflict is things like personality conflict, like, I don't like you, Gareth. I think you're a jerk, so I'm going to fight with you. That's not necessarily good conflict. So what we need to do is understand that when there's conflicting occurring, it can be a signal to something going on. So instead of thinking tension or conflict is bad, once we feel it, we might experience it as bad. It might feel bad, but we need to, in our head, say, oh, let's see what's going on here. This might be adaptive tension. And if we see people who are beginning to engage in different ways of thinking about how to do things, or they're arguing over procedures or methods, there's a very good chance that's adaptive tension. So look at that, recognize it, pay attention to it. The tension that people are experiencing is signaling a need to change. We don't want to get rid of it, we want to engage it. And the way to do that is what I refer to as playing in the pressures. And complexity, the key dynamic or the key force is the pressure that comes in on the system. So once again, I would ask you to look at yourselves. That's the easiest way to think about this. Either you or you in your workplace. Are you experiencing pressures? So are you on this webinar taking valuable time out of your schedule today to listen to this because you're feeling some kind of pressure? Where does that pressure come from? Is that pressure self-induced? So that's a pressure you have because you don't like being bored, or a pressure you have because you think things can be done better and you're looking for ways to fix it. Or maybe it's pressures in the organization that have been placed on you by a manager or someone else who says, we've got to think about doing things differently. And now you own that and you have to deal with it. Pressures are important because they loosen up or motivate a system to change. So what you want to do is use those pressures. If people are not feeling pressures, or agents or systems are not feeling pressures, they're likely going to stay in equilibrium, because systems want to stay in equilibrium. You want to look at NHS, it probably wants to stay in equilibrium. And I bet if I had a room full of you, you'd be nodding your head yes. But what the pressures do is loosen it up. So they create the opportunity for you. They also create the clues or the signals to the direction in which you should change. So we can talk more about that if you have questions, but hopefully you get that concept. The other thing is you need to understand that conflicting is a part of the process. I think too many people don't recognize that. And so if they get pushback, or if they get someone who says no, or someone who disagrees with an idea, they take that as, oh, I've got to stop. This is no good, or this is a bad idea, this is stupid, I shouldn't be doing it, or they won't let me do it, or this organization is rigid, or that person is resistant to change. I would encourage you to not do any of that. Instead, what you need to do is expect it as part of the process. Conflicting is going to happen. So what you need to do is manage the process you're doing to avoid the brick wall. And what I mean by that is the brick wall is going to be the natural force in the system that keeps it in equilibrium, keeps it in a steady state. And it's biased to say no to anything new. So its natural bias is not going to accept it. And my number one piece of advice to you is don't ask it for permission. Don't approach saying, can I do this? Or asking for a yes kind of answer, because most likely you're going to get no. Instead, when you're approaching, expect conflicting, so seek input or seek feedback. Don't seek an answer or permission. So you go and you say, do you think this could work? What would it take for this to happen? What kinds of obstacles would there be in the way? You do more of those open-ended kinds of questions instead of going and asking. So I was working with a physician group a year ago. There was a woman, a physician, who was very upset because she was really passionate about an idea. She had called a meeting, had the decision makers in the room, presented the idea, and she got a no. And then she was upset. And still, I think it was a year or two later by the time she told me the story. And I said, yeah, but you did the process the wrong way. You shouldn't have done it that way, to where you call the decision makers in the room. Instead, you need to pursue it. You need to approach it. And you only ask really for permission when you've already gotten approval. So she hadn't done the legwork behind it to try to get something done in the system. And again, we can talk more about that, but this is a really important concept. And then I like this concept from Heifetz, which is cook the conflict. This is for situations where you are in charge of others. So you're doing more of an enabling role. Others are trying to work through the conflict, and you want to make sure that that conflicting occurs. What you do is, if you're trying to get a creative or adapt a solution and they're not being creative enough, you increase the tension. So you introduce or inject more tension to get more conflicting to occur. If the conflicting is so high that it's bordering on chaos and they feel like they can't get anywhere, then you bring it back down. So that's the cook the conflict idea. And there are lots of interesting things to do with that. All right, so then let's talk about connecting in the context of conflicting. So there are two kinds of connecting, remember. So this is connecting and conflicting. Let's take that example of cook the conflict. So I've got a bunch of you in the room. It's not generating anything. I inject more tension. So I give you an additional challenge, or I play devil's advocate and argue against a point you're making. Now I get conflicting going, or I require you to do something you're not comfortable with. All right, now that can break down into being too high, which in some points then I need to show connecting. So it's kind of in my back pocket. I have to know if the conflicting gets so extreme that they don't know how to see commonality in it. I have to know how to inject that commonality in to get people back together. Or the other thing I do is I listen, and I'm sure many of you out there do this and are skilled at it. I listen carefully to what's going on to see what sparks, what's coming off, what am I hearing from the different groups that if we link it up and put it together, something really cool can come out of it. That's a creative skill, a creative process. I think it's a really important one for leaders and one that we haven't looked at enough. So that's the capturing the ideas that spark out of conflicting. I can tell stories on it, but I won't have enough time to get through everything. So if you have more questions, we can come back. And I think quite often this is both and thinking. Too many times we create false dichotomies to where we assume it has to be one or the other. I would really encourage you to do more both and. So I'll give you a very, very quick story on this. Just recently, we had a department chair split where our entrepreneurship group went off because we felt it was an important area that needed more strategic attention. So now we're left as the management department. They took all of our majors with them. So we're an undergrad institution. We have to make sure that we have majors from our department. This became a crisis because all of a sudden we look at our numbers, we have no majors. So I said, I'll take this one on. So I then went out and I started looking at our management major and what we could do with it. And instead of thinking it needs to be a management major standalone, we need to take it from other majors, we're in competition, I said, actually, management is a great second major. We're a good double major because if you have a discipline area, then you combine management with it. So then what I did is I pursued, how can we think about this as a double major? How can we make it easier? That's a win-win all around because nobody else loses in it. Students benefit from it. And what I did is I worked the system to figure out how they can do this more easily by the way we set up our major. So that's more both and thinking rather than win-lose. Finding ways to connect across differences, and the more that I talk about this and do this, I realize it's just negotiation. I think a lot of this is negotiation. And as I do this work and engage in this kind of leadership, I didn't know I was doing it, but there's a lot of negotiation skill that goes into it. And the basic of that is that in complexity, it's about the common need. What's the common need? And that's what you're looking for in negotiation. What is it that is the zone of the bargaining zone? What do we need together? What can we do together? Where can we find similarities with each other in terms of how we can do things? So this brings in a lot of negotiation. And then another conflict management tool that I learned recently, actually I learned this at the DC conference when somebody shared what they did with me, is superordinate identity. So a higher level identity can bring people together. And the easiest way to think about that is in the context of Brexit, we're all British, or in the context of the US and the challenges we have, instead of Democrats, Republicans, we're all American. So that's the superordinate identity. In healthcare, you can do this. The person who told me the story was conflict among teachers, and what this individual did was say, why did you all get into teaching? So in healthcare, why are you nurses? What unites you as nurses? Or physicians, what is it that you do? Why are you here? Well, we're here for patients. So that can be the superordinate identity that unites people. Okay, so that's the first part of connecting. The other part is in the form of linking up. And this is where you're looking for poised agents that you can bring together. So this network right here has a lot of people in it. And Matthew was already saying, and Gareth were talking about people as part of your group, your community. Well, you can bring people together in that community. They're poised for change. When you put them together in the right situation, they can generate novelty. So that's a form of linking up. It's also about fostering network connections, and I'm going to come more to this. But in organizational settings, we know we operate in silos. We know that we don't engage enough across the different areas. And so fostering network links is really important. And then enabling or activating information flows. So I put this after the network connections, because if you have the network set up and you have what you need, then what you can do when you need to use it is activate it. So activate that network to generate the information flows that can get things done. Okay, now I am running down on time very quickly, so I'm going to go fast through this. What does adaptive space look like in our heads? Remember, this is fractal again. So we have in our heads, but then we also have in the organization. So let's start with in our heads. I'm not sure who all is on the phone or on the call in terms of the place you're coming from or how you're thinking about this, but I would bet some of you are just adaptive people in a lot of the adaptive spaces in your head. So this is space to think, ideate, problem solve, create, and it's these kinds of questions. And usually what you're doing is problem solving. You're thinking through, I want to get somewhere. How can I get there? How can I overcome obstacles? Again, I encourage you to do the both and thinking. So you're not framing things so narrowly that you think it has to be. And usually it involves some planning or strategizing around how you're going to actually enact the thing that you're trying to do. Okay, then what does adaptive space look like in organizations? This is the complexity leadership model that I've written about in the papers and is in the previous webinar. So it starts off more in the entrepreneurial. There's somebody, some individual or small group or even a bigger group that has a new idea, and they're pushing for novelty, for learning, for innovation, for growth. That's the entrepreneurial. Remember, it can happen anywhere. So entrepreneurial can happen at the top. This is what's so interesting about it. This can be the top management team that's being entrepreneurial, that's trying to push it out. So it's not always that this goes up. It can also attempt to go down and be blocked going down, just like it can be blocked going up. So don't assume there's a hierarchical preference here. Then what happens is it goes out into the organization as it tries to get bigger and to create change in the larger system, whatever level that larger system is. And that's the adaptive space that's needed in the organization. That's the role the enabling leaders do. So there are two ways we can think about this. One is I'm the entrepreneurial person who's pushing it out. If I'm that entrepreneurial person and I'm now deciding I'm going to try to drive this change in the system or in the organization, then I need to switch to enabling. So entrepreneurial isn't going to be the leadership style that's going to work anymore. I need to do enabling. The challenge is many entrepreneurial people can't do enabling. So this is where it gets to the collective idea. Leadership is not about an individual. Leadership is a collective process. It requires many people. They work together in the different functions that they do. So what you want to do is then find somebody who's good at enabling. You can partner with them or you can hand it off to them, however you want to do that. You see in this picture, those sparks are the conflicting. So you still have conflicting that occurs. You have to work through the conflicting process, and then hopefully you get connecting so that it starts to flow across the organization, which is what is happening here. And then you have the operational system. So the operational system is the one that's responsible for getting it in and making this change happen in the form of new order. So this produces the results. In Jim March's model, he would call this exploitation. So this is where you're actually taking something And it has reached scale in that you're able to implement it into the system in the form of new order. And that big gray dot there is usually a sponsor. Somebody, and there can be more than one, but somebody in the operational system that helps to realign that system to accommodate the change. All right, so how do we do adaptive space in organizations then? Well, it starts with identifying the entrepreneurial leaders. I think that's pretty obvious. So I'm just gonna leave that up and you can look at it. But it starts with entrepreneurial, so you need to know who those are. And if it's not you, if you're not the entrepreneurial, you're more the enabling, then you need to really pay attention to the people who are doing this. And sometimes they can look like difficult people. They can look like they're annoying, they're constantly pushing for something different. This doesn't necessarily have a positive skew to it. People who are doing this can come across as difficult or argumentative, those kinds of things. But pay attention to people who are pushing for novelty and then look at why. If they're doing it just to advance their own interest, self-interest, that's usually not going to be very good. But if they're experiencing complexity pressures and they're seeing things in their area that are causing the system to have to change, and that signal I talked about earlier from pressures, that's what you want to look for. All right, so identify entrepreneurial leaders and then enable them to generate emergence. So this can start on the micro scale where you give them the time and the resources, or it can be helping them push their idea forward in adaptive space. And then the critical thing, and this gets to your question of how do we do it in a system that's not supportive, is you want to have a supportive operational system. So that would be the ideal case. And I will tell you some stories because we have some of those. All right, so enabling emergence individually or small group. Again, give them time to think, ideate, explore, create, innovate. Provide resources, whatever resources they might need. So it might be linking them up with others or linking them up with other information. It might be encouraging them to boundary span. So allowing them to go out to different areas, engage with different groups, or even go outside the organization and attend events or conferences or whatever it is that helps them to gather more information. And then seed money or access to equipment. I always caution, don't do too much seed money. You don't want to make them too rich. You want to keep that tension in there and pressure them. And seed money is something that I offer carefully. I think you need to think very carefully about that. And then doing it more collectively, foster network connections. I'm going to list off and then I'll give you an example. Link up with people in the operational system, tie to strategic goals, navigate politics. So let me give you some examples. We have a physician, two healthcare systems we're working with here in Fort Worth. When I came, we wanted to start executive ed, and I had done work in healthcare because I'd done the research. We had a hospital that was approaching us about a physician leadership program. I said, I've done this, I know how to do it, let's talk with them. And we did, and we changed it beyond just physicians. So the first group we put through was physicians, but then I said to them at the very beginning, if you really want to make change in your organization, it shouldn't be just physicians. You need to have others in the room as well. So what we do in this program, we have the chief medical officer, who is our primary sponsor. We have high-level executives, so the chief administrative officer. We have HR people in the room. We called it the peanut gallery in the back of the room, where these executives would sit in every group we're at 5 cohorts now. They sit in every group that goes through every session. So we have executive sponsorship. But the important thing about that executive sponsorship is that what they do, the chief medical officer identifies entrepreneurial leaders. So started with entrepreneurial physicians, usually the first or second group. So these are really pretty exciting because you get the super entrepreneurial people. And then what we did is we started bringing in operational people. So we've brought in all the high level administrative people. We have the attorney, we have finance people, we have IT, we have the chief of staff who's gone through the program. And what that does is that then creates the connection between the physicians and the operational. And as they sit in the room together, they learn more about the different worldviews that they bring. So physicians' eyes are opened as they listen to the operational people talk about what it means to be in their position. Instead of them being the enemy, they now start to understand the way they think, where they come from, mindset, etc. And then what we do is we tie it to strategic goals. So we brought in the CEO, and the CEO will present the critical strategic goals that are related to the people in the room. And we have conversation with them about how they can work toward those goals. And we have lots of discussions about power and politics so that they understand it. All right, what that has done is create this network. In over 5 cohorts now, we've really created culture change in this organization where people who've gone through have not only their cohort, but other cohorts who have a common view now of what leadership is and the things they're trying to accomplish. They've worked on projects, and those projects are strategic initiative projects from the chief medical officer. Sometimes they can't finish it in one cohort, so they pass it off to the next. But essentially what we've done is build a network. As a result of that, one of the people in the first program, Justin Smith, when I put up the complexity model the first time, I had just introduced it. I just set it out. He said, well, let me tell you how I do this. And he rattled off 3 or 4 examples of him doing that in Cook Children's. And I was shocked. I was like, wow, you know, that's the ideal as a person in a room. You want somebody to be able to do that. Well, Justin really got it. And so he understood the model intuitively. And as a result, what Cook did is they wanted to empower him and enable him to think about how he can do more of this. So he now leads the innovation department. It's a new department. All right, so that gives you the basics of the ideas. I want to quickly wrap up. The supportive operational system, the way that looks is operational leaders who are motivated and equipped to accomplish change. In these programs that we're doing, that's what the operational leaders do. They come in at the beginning, they say, we want to help you. We want you to understand that our strategic initiative is to help physicians become more engaged and get these outcomes. Here's what we can do and how we can partner with you in it. And their incentives are tied to it. So it's really critical that that kind of thing happen. Act as sponsors. What those people do is the finance people say at the beginning, we know you guys don't know how to do a business case. So as you're going forward with your initiative, come to us and we will sit with you and we will show you. And in fact, we'll do it for you. We'll put the business case around it. We'll do the financials for you so that as you're coming forward, you have the best chance possible to get this initiative in, assuming the initiative is a good one. And then supportive IT sits through this every time because as we all know, they often become the infrastructure that's hardest to change. All right, what do you do if there's an unsupportive one? And this is gonna be more common than the great story I'm telling you about. The most important thing here is you can do it, but it's gonna be hard and it's gonna burn a lot of your own personal energy. So most likely people will experience burnout. I'm not gonna lie about it. It becomes an individual decision as to whether you do it, you have enough energy. You might be able to do it on small local level. You have better chance if you've got more people who you can connect and link up with who have a similar way of thinking, which is why we try to get this work out to more people so that those networks can form. But the tips I would give you is fly under the radar. Don't necessarily try to teach everybody this model or get them to see it. You can do it. You can get these changes in without being vocal about it. And one way to do it is to scale through small changes. So we had an associate dean here for graduate studies who got a whole new graduate curriculum put in and nobody even knew he did it. He did it course by course. Each meeting, each faculty meeting, he brings something new. And he also did the same thing. He started a healthcare MBA. And nobody even really knew he was doing this because it just looked like little changes, a course here, a course there. Before you know it, you have a whole new curriculum. So you can scale through small changes. You don't have to be out front. We had another associate dean who tried to do a massive change to our undergrad and it got shot down immediately because he did it all wrong. He put a committee together. He designed this beautiful, and I will tell you, it was a beautiful, really innovative new undergrad curriculum. But because it changed things for faculty, he, instead of going out and doing the legwork behind the scenes and bringing it in little bits or getting the advocates on board, he took it to a faculty meeting thinking this is how things work. It's the story I told earlier. as you can imagine, he puts this big proposal up and immediately it's shot down. Not even one element of it went through. So you have to think very carefully. You can do small changes. You have to navigate power and politics. Usually what people do is they'll do this with individual connections. You get people on board with the individual things you want to do. The thing that many people miss is you want to tie it to strategy and to managerial goals. So if you don't know your organization strategy, I'm going to tell you you are disadvantaged. You need to go out, read the strategy, understand what it is, understand what managerial goals are, and then you frame everything up in the context of that. Use the informal system, which is what I'm saying. Don't do it through formal meetings, formal decision-making things. Usually, I like to say, do that when it's done. When it's been approved, that's the rubber stamp of approval. But you want to get the informal approval first. So get buy-in, get people who are on your side so that when you come to that meeting, it's just stamping it. Take breathers to manage your own burnout. You are going to burn out. It's the reality of it. The reason we have so much burnout right now in healthcare is because we're demanding more of people, but our infrastructures have not changed. So we're asking everybody to do complexity and adaptive kind of work in an environment that's not conducive to it. And until that changes, we're going to continue to see the burnout. And then I would say, don't be a threat, especially to leaders above you. If they think you're really smart, if they think you're skilled and savvy and that you're doing that and it's harming them in some way, you're going to be a threat. So be careful about that. All right, outcomes. Frame all outcomes in the context of strategic goals. Put a business case around it. Understand the financials. Have financial performance data, but have those people help you frame the benefits. If it's a learning outcome, tie it to how it will lead to future viability. And again, make friends with IT, because IT is going to usually be critical to anything you're trying to do. All right, so I had to rush at the end because I know I'm way over time. How you enable space, adaptive space, depends on where you are, whether you're the one pushing it or whether you're trying to enable others to do it. It's two different things, and conversations around that are different. Healthcare systems that aren't set up for adaptability, and most aren't, are contributing to the burnout problem. Innovation spread is not just about spreading innovation. So the reason I didn't keep that in the title is it's not like you just spread one innovation. I have this innovation, I'm going to go everywhere with it. Instead, I like to view it more as enabling adaptability. And adaptability means getting more people to think adaptive, and it's usually more local level and not a one size fits all. All right, so we have a few minutes left for Q&A. I'm sorry I went long, Matthew and Gareth. I knew it was going to be a challenge. So I'll turn it over to you.
Mary, thank you very much for that. That was really good. There have been a few questions popping up in the chat space. Olivia Bush was asking about case studies, and I know that you've spoken to some case studies. So if I hold that question and then move on to another one. So Julie Denome was wondering about how you cultivate the quality of that connecting piece. So could you say something more about that?
So if you can pop on, unmute, and ask me more about that, cultivate the quality of the connecting. I just need to know more about what you're asking.
I was just asked, hi, it's Julie speaking.
Hi, Julie.
So when we were talking about connecting and what some people say they connect, but the quality of their connecting is there's no trust, it's more competitive. So what are the ingredients required when we talk about connecting in this complexity approach?
That is such a great question. And I love that you ask it. You're not probably going to like my answer. So my answer is you don't necessarily have to have high quality connecting.
Really?
Yeah, I think many people, it's great if you do, if you have trust, but sometimes people just have a common need. It's like in politics, they come together and they form an alliance around something. They don't have to be friends necessarily. If it's something where you can form an alliance and get something done and it's beneficial to the organization, I would hope, then you don't have to have the highest quality connection. Where you need the higher quality connections is in the ideating space. So where people are trying to flesh out ideas, then you really need to have trust, because when a person pushes back, and you get that feedback, you need to trust that their motives are right. But, you know, quite often you can do this without the highest quality.
Thank you.
Okay, so Marcus Janel also asked a question around the aggregate to meta-aggregate to emergence, and was asking if you could say a bit more about that, Mary.
Yeah, so emergence happens when things scale up, when they get more momentum or more movement, energy behind them. And as we were doing this work in the early years, somebody described it as the snowball. They said it was my idea, and then I put it out there, and it was still my idea, and all of a sudden this thing snowballs, and it's way beyond me. That's a pretty common thing when you're talking about emergence. So understand that if you really are pushing something that's a more major change and it's going to go further in the organization, it likely will snowball, and the idea will morph and will not necessarily be your idea anymore, or even maybe not what you intended. So you have to hope that it accomplishes what you're trying to do. And I think the best case scenario is to keep the idea in mind of what you're trying to accomplish and not the specifics on the how. So to do that, then you have to build the momentum. That means in the way the process usually occurs, somebody individually or locally will start to develop it. They'll socialize it to their local group. They might implement it locally, and then they try to grow it bigger. And as they try to grow it bigger, that's when you reach out. The only way it can grow bigger is if you do that conflicting connecting. So there will naturally be conflicting. You've got to iterate the idea to get it to where people can connect with you. And then that gets you to a meta aggregate. So now you've got an aggregate, a small group, it gets bigger. And in the emergence process, we describe it as a phase transition, that in some cases it can get bigger and bigger, but then it can tip into a phase transition where it morphs into something different that's not about the aggregate anymore. So this would be like groups that are rebel groups that become a revolution, or movements where you see all of a sudden this thing's taken on a life of its own. Hopefully I answered it, but that's the basic process.
Excellent. So a few more questions. Tom wanted to know about how you capture activity. So how do you document what you're doing in an active space, an adaptive space?
Yeah, and that's a really good question as well. I'm going to say I don't know quite as much about this because it's only recently that we've really begun to understand that our incentive systems are not set up around adaptability. So when I did my most recent academic paper, which you all don't want to read because it is a monster to read, what I discovered is that we don't have outcomes that are about adaptability. They're all performance outcomes. So that means you've got to be pretty creative in how you do this. Document everything you do, but remember how you frame it. So you're framing it, you need to not document it from what's important to you or what matters to you, but what matters to the organization. So you might have a motive or an incentive in terms of what you think this can do for your local system, but really take your activity, document it, and always talk about how it can tie into the managerial goals or whatever group, the goals of the group that you're trying to target, or the strategic goals. You can never lose if you're tying it into strategic goals, because that's the language of the organization.
Okay, so a few more. Just keeping an eye on the time. We've still got another 10 minutes. So Becca and Laurie were both asking about, I suppose, what additional considerations do you need to take on board when you're working across a broader ecosystem? So a number of organizations together,
yes,
a whole system type adaptive space.
Yes, and I will say again, I haven't done this yet. This is, all the work we've done has been in the context of an organizational setting, primarily because that's the area, that's what the work that I have done is in leadership, and usually it's within an organization. Strategy is usually the area that looks more at multi-sector collaboration. That said, I'm now about to start that process. So in the next year, I'm really going to be pushing in our own healthcare work that we do exactly what you're asking about. It came up because we've created so much positive change in the healthcare systems that we're working with that I began to realize we're kind of going to max out. There won't be, there is a limit to how many groups we can do and how many cohorts we can influence. And so I'm thinking ahead again using complexity kind of thinking. I was at a forum in our community, and it was 6 healthcare CEOs, and they were talking about challenges in the community around healthcare. And of course, as you all know, population health is a big one, mental health, other kinds of things like this. And it struck me that we don't have any way in our community for those groups to come together and have the conversation. They're all working on it individually in their organization. You might have some people who are doing limited outreach, but we don't really have an adaptive space. So what I'm going to do as part of our healthcare MBA is we've got an integrative project, and I'm going to start using that to create adaptive space around a challenge that is in the community here locally in Fort Worth that these leaders talked about. I'm going to get the endorsement of the CEOs from those systems, ask them to send key people that they think would be a core for having conversation around that, and then we'll generate an adaptive space to see what we can do, and we'll try to tie that to a specific project and outcome that we're trying to accomplish. The thing I will tell you is it takes experimentation. So it's not like you just go and you do it. The process will be one of experimentation. And when I talk with these healthcare leaders, I will tell them we aren't going to get it right away. It might take several iterations, many iterations, but if we can accomplish any kinds of positive change in this, even if the percentage is low, the impact will be great. So that's the way that I view that.
Okay. Rachel was wondering whether when you're trying to introduce this into an organization, does everybody need to know about this, or do you target a few key people to help kind of get an understanding?
Right. We've been targeting key people. The issue is that not everybody needs to know, and not everybody will get it. And in fact, you can build up resistance against it. So you want to start with people who, as I say, are poised, and you bring them in. From the cohorts we do, I won't say that we've got everybody who's perfectly on board with this. They're all exposed to it, so they understand it and are aware of it. They're not necessarily the champions, but what we do get out of it is a certain percentage who are champions and who are really activated. And I've long used the term Energizer Bunny for these people. So you get the Energizer Bunnies revved up, and then you give them networks and opportunities and connections and endorsement from the top in a strategic umbrella that they can operate in, and they just do amazing things.
Are you okay for a couple more questions, Mary, before we finish
Sure.
up?
Yes.
Okay. So Minesh was asking about, in the context of the NHS where competition isn't a driver or I guess a pressure, what's the best currency to help drive adaptive change?
I did see that question as part of the list, and I'm glad it came up. I wasn't able to stick it in the slide deck. So probably Minesh is familiar with the idea and complexity that adaptability comes when survival is threatened. So in this work, I've worked a lot with military and government, and it's often difficult because people will come and say, what can we do? And I say, you know, the real key dynamic of complexity is having your survival threatened. When you're threatened with death, it can really trigger some pretty incredible behavior. When you're not, you can get comfortable and it keeps you in equilibrium. So I'm just going to say that's the reality of it. If it's an organization that's really deep in equilibrium, stuck there, there's not a whole lot you can do. The one exception is this: if there are pressures. So that's where it's playing the pressures. If there are no pressures, people don't feel any of it, you're trying to push a giant rock. It's David and Goliath. You're not, well, David won, but you're not going to win. It's going to be a lose. But if you can identify pressures and real pressures that are loosening things up even in pockets, there's some things you can do. The other exception is you might get some leaders in who are visionary and who understand this, and they can try to drive it. But just like those entrepreneurial leaders I talked about, they don't have the power either. They're still working against that same system. But if you've got leaders like that, then you have an opportunity to try to create some change. The problem there is that if those leaders are doing it and it's leader-led, not in a system, then when those leaders leave, it will go away, most likely, unless you've gotten real change into the system.
Okay.
Sorry, it's a depressing answer, but it's the reality of it.
It's really helpful. There have been some questions asked and answered in the chat space around evaluation and different methodologies being suggested. So probably another question from Julie around what does an adaptive space actually look like in physical terms? So is that time allocated for a meeting? Is that structured? Is there a physical space to work? Is it about online communication? So I guess, how do we understand that in a tangible way, Mary?
Okay, so it's space, so it's fluid and dynamic. It's not a structure, it's not necessarily an ongoing thing. So our physician leadership programs are adaptive space. They come on campus, they engage, we engage them in conflicting, we do the network connections, and we challenge them in different things. So that would be an adaptive space. Now, when those people are done with that program, they aren't necessarily part of it. We still have it running with that organization. That's an example. Some leaders create meetings that are adaptive space. Sometimes you can do it with a group. Sometimes you can enable people on assignments that are adaptive space. And some organizations I see have a physical place they call adaptive space, which is intended for people to come and ideate. Whether that works or not, I don't know, but I do know that some people actually allot physical space to it. If you're familiar with design thinking is intended to spark adaptive space.
There are more questions, Mary, but I think we probably need to just give you an opportunity to offer any closing thoughts. So perhaps what we could do is we could post the questions in some of the special interest groups. So I wanted to give a mention to go onto the Q site and look for those special interest groups or the Exploring Adaptive Space Community of Practice, and maybe we can continue those conversations online together. But Mary, before we finish, any final comments, any closing thoughts that you'd like to share with us?
I want to thank you all for being here. I hope that it was helpful. I do know I went long, but I think I was trying to answer your questions and going longer in the slide deck. I would offer that Gareth and Matthew, if you can continue to use your community as adaptive space, I think that you all have answers that can help each other more than me. If you get the basic ideas, filling in details you can do for each other. But Matthew and Gareth, if you see things that come up that are questions that people have and you want to feed them to me or invite me into the space to answer particular questions, I'd be happy to do that in the coming months, year.
Thank you very much. Matthew, any final thoughts from yourself?
No, just great to hear, you know, a bit more of the kind of tangible nitty-gritty of it all beyond what we learned in the first Zoom. So it's really useful and inspiring.
Okay, so Mary, thank you very much indeed for the time that you've taken with us. It's been really interesting, and I think looking again at the comments, people are saying how excellent they found it. So thank you very much indeed.
Wonderful, thank you.
Okay, thank you all. That's the end.
Thanks everyone, happy holidays.